Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to English 101. I'm your instructor, Todd Soul. Wanted to talk to you a little bit in this short video about writing the introduction to a narrative essay. Now, knowing how to start can be a very, very difficult process, I think. If you're like me, I don't know always how I want to start until I know what I've written. So it's a kind of thing where as I'm writing, the story is evolving and how I want to begin it is evolving and changing. And sometimes the story changes as well. So introductions are typically the last thing I write. However, because this is a narrative descriptive piece and you're intimately familiar with your own story, you may already have an idea, in your head how you would like to do that. But I would like to talk about some strategies as you write your first draft, and hopefully one of these will suit your narrative descriptive essay. I'm going to talk about two types of beginnings. I'm going to talk about hard beginnings and soft beginnings. And we're going to start with soft first of all. So soft beginnings, one of the easiest ways to start is with the setting details of the story. You've probably heard the term setting before. It means the time, place of the story. It's probably one of the easiest ways to begin a narrative. And the idea is you are using description to work your way out or into the narrative. One of the best examples is the very first page of chapter 1 of Susan Collins' The Hunger Games. And I'll read a little bit to you. It may be hard for you to see it all. And notice how this is just Katniss, the main character, the heroine of the story, just waking up and describing what she sees. And we learn a great deal about the story that's coming. When I wake up, the other side of the bed is cold. My fingers stretch out, seeking Prim's warmth, but finding only the rough canvas cover of the mattress. She must have had bad dreams and climbed in with our mother. Of course she did. This is the day of the reaping. I prop myself up on one elbow. There's enough light in the bedroom to see them. My little sister Prim, curled up on her side, cocooned in my mother's body, their cheeks pressed together. In sleep, my mother looks younger, still worn, but not so beaten down. Prim's face is as fresh as a raindrop, as lovely as the primrose for which she was named. My mother was very beautiful once too, or so they tell me. Sitting at Prim's knees, guarding her, is the world's ugliest cat, mashed in nose, half of one ear missing, eyes the color of rotting squash. Prim named him Buttercup, insisting that his muddy yellow coat matched the bright flower. He hates me, or at least distrusts me. Even though it was years ago, I think he still remembers how I tried to drown him in a bucket when Prim brought him home. Scrawny kitten, belly swollen with worms, crawling with fleas. The last thing I needed was another mouth to feed. But Prim begged so hard, cried even, I had to let him stay. So this is a nice example, obviously as a professional writer, of working our way into the story. We learn the characters' names, we learn a little bit about their living conditions, we learn, of course, most importantly, about the reaping. Another technique is to introduce yourself, and this is kind of a familiar device where you use pronouns like I, me, and my, and of course you're going to be using those throughout the story as well. First person is celebrated in this narrative descriptive essay. Here's one of the most famous examples. I'm sure most of you have never read Moby Dick by Herman Melville. It's a classic American novel, and I know I read it in high school when it was still a requirement. I didn't get it then, but when I read it in college, I appreciated it much more. But notice how Melville introduces himself as a character he's created. Call me Ishmael. Some years ago, never mind how long precisely, having little or no money in my purse and nothing particular to interest me on shore, I thought I would sail about a little and see the watery part of the world. It is a way I have of driving off the spleen and regulating circulation. Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntarily pausing before coffin warehouses and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, and especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I account it high time to get to sea as soon as I can. Whew, that's a big mouthful, that last sentence, isn't it? Now, this is an older style, but, and he talks about, his hypos. What he's really talking about is like what we would call like seasonal affective disorder now. When it's a drizzly November, he gets depressed and has to do something. But I love the intimacy, right? Call me Ishmael. It's like, oh, it's like he's initiating a conversation with us. Let's talk about hard beginnings. And by hard beginnings, I mean abrupt, solid, sometimes even startling. One of the techniques you've probably heard of before, if you've ever studied like the Odyssey, or I always tell people the Star Wars movies are a good example of this, is the concept of in medias res, which in Latin just means in the middle of things, or what we would call a flashback. So the idea is, for example, the Star Wars movies, 1, 2, and 3 are actually 4, 5, and 6, the original Star Wars. And then they did the prequels, 1, 2, and 3, and then they finished off on most recently with 7, 8, and 9. So they started in the middle of things with Luke Skywalker story and Princess Leia story, then went back to the beginning, and then circled back to the end. Here's a great example from a student essay a few years ago. With an abrupt clunk, a hollow and metallic thud, I felt the front of the car collapse and a sudden pain in my chest. Was it the airbag? Had I crunched upon the steering wheel? I drifted between real time and slow motion. Notice the abruptness of that. And if you've been in a sudden car accident, you know that sort of strange feeling, almost otherworldly in terms of how time is moving or what you hear, and even the pain. So when she wrote this story, she started with the actual accident, and then kind of went back and told what led up to it, and then picked up where she left off, and it ended up being a real riveting essay, because people really wanted to get to her ending and conclusion to see what would happen. So this is an in medias res one. Flashback is very similar. Flashback, you may or may not circle back, um, to the beginning. It might be something that you flash back and then you just go to the present. But they're very similar in style. Let me just show you a classic example of a children's author who used this to great effect. Now, most of you are probably familiar with Charlotte's Web. If you've never read it, it's an E.B. White novel, as well as Stuart Little. If you don't cry when Charlotte dies at the end, you really have no heart, I think. Oh, spoiler alert. Sorry about that. But just to show you an interesting technique he used following in medias res, this is chapter 3. Now, originally, E.B. White had this as chapter 1, and it's called Escape. And you kind of get the idea it's going to be a hard, abrupt beginning. But notice the way it starts. The barn was very large. It was very old. It smelled of hay and it smelled of manure. It smelled of the perspiration of tired horses and the wonderful sweet breath of patient cows. It often had a sort of peaceful smell, as though nothing bad could ever again happen in the world. It smelled of grain and of harness dressing and of axle grease and of rubber boots and of new rope. And whenever the cat was given a fish head to eat, the barn would smell of fish. But mostly it smelled of hay, for there was always hay in the great loft up overhead, and there was always hay being pitched down to the cows and the horses and the sheep. So this is really a soft beginning, isn't it? Now, originally, like I said, this was going to be chapter 1, but he said, I'm going to switch this up and do something a little bit different. So here's the chapter that he actually started with. "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. Now, how about that for an opening line? And I'm sure he got some pushback from his editors because this is a children's novel after all. And we learn, of course, that a runt pig has been born in the litter. And Fern is able to get her father, obviously, to save the pig. Wilbur is his name. But again, he decided to go with a hard beginning. So this was chapter 3. It became chapter 1, and he moved Escape to a different location in chapter 3. So excellent technique. There are other ideas. Here's one I got from a military veteran. I think he was a veteran of the Second Iraq War, and he talked about an incident in combat. Notice the way he begins. Whump. The RPG went off in an explosion of concrete, stone, and dust. It had impacted somewhere to my left, I thought, and my ears were muffled like I was sinking underwater. Very hard beginning. I talked to him about the word wump, and I said, should we use an exclamation mark there? And he said, I don't think so. And he had me take my hands and kind of clap them against my ears. Don't, you could try it actually, just don't do it too hard. You actually will hurt your eardrums. But when you do that, everything is muffled. And he said he really doesn't remember the explosion so much as the wump feeling and the muffled sounds. Obviously, there was an audible noise, but for what he remembered about it was just that whoomp, that sort of cloudiness in your hearing that sounds like you're underwater and you can't hear. Another idea is dialogue. Dialogue is a great technique. You'll probably include some of it if you have characters, and you're probably going to have other people in your story. Your personal story will involve family members, probably your friends or coworkers or students or whatever it might be. Dialogue is a little tricky to write, so if you do write dialogue, I'm going to give you some examples later on after first drafts of where you can look for the right punctuation. But here's kind of a humorous example I had from a student a few years back as well. Why do you keep doing that? You know it annoys me. I had said this about 1,000,000 times before. Why don't you just leave the room? My sister spluttered. You don't need to be here. I need to clip my nails. Everyone does. If it grosses you out, then go away. She didn't raise her eyes, but if we made eye contact, it would only get worse. But the TV is in here, and I like to watch without your cuticles flying everywhere, I pleaded. One of them landed on me, and I involuntarily flinched. Ew, I spat back. Great introduction technique there. We already learned that there are two sisters here and that they are probably not getting along, and that might lead us into a great story about them. So regardless of how you start your narrative descriptive essay, a lot of times what I'll have people do if they don't know how to start is I'll say, just write the story. And then, you can go back and figure out a technique that might work for you to begin it so that we have that hook. We often talk about that hook. What does it take to help the reader kind of not want to leave your essay and keep reading further? So that's all for now. We'll talk more about narrative descriptive essays later on. Take care.